Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Sony Alpha Classroom. Hi, I'm Sudhir Shuram, an award-winning wildlife photographer and a proud Sony artisan. Today we are going to embark on a thrilling journey to uncover the various essential camera settings for wildlife photography, paying more attention and focus to the Sony Alpha cameras. As I always say, the essence of wildlife photography lies in capturing the untamed spirit of nature. So, let's dive in and uncover these secrets together. When we talk about wildlife photography and the essential camera settings, I'm going to give you the important tips in a specific order so that you can remember some of these settings. Now, the other very important thing is your camera has so many settings, and especially in wildlife photography, you will not have the time to go through each of those settings. So I'm going to give you those simple tips where you can get amazing images by putting in key parameters and then forgetting about it. So let's start with white balance as the first parameter. Now, white balance is a particular camera setting which is going to give you amazing colors in your image. So white balance is responsible for colors in your image. Now, the white balance is expressed with presets like daylight, tungsten, cloudy, shade, flash. So these are all the presets, whereas there's also manual white balance, which is expressed in Kelvin values. Now, each of these presets is nothing but a preset of the Kelvin value. For example, the daylight is 5200 Kelvin. The first tip for white balance. In normal situation, daytime, between say morning like 8 AM till evening around 4 PM kind of a thing, where the light is more or less flat, for those situations, use a white balance of 5800 Kelvin. So you can use flash in case you don't have manual white balance. And very early morning before the sun comes up, keep a white balance of shade, say around 7000 Kelvin. The same applies to late evening after sunset, where again you have to keep around 7000 Kelvin as the white balance. Now, the other important tip for white balance is when you're shooting directly against the sunrise or the sunset, to create those amazing silhouette images, use a magical white balance of 9990 Kelvin or 10,000 Kelvin depending on your camera setting, because that is where you're going to get amazing golden colors. The next important essential camera setting is exposure, which is a combination of your exposure triangle parameters, which is dependent on the kind of metering mode what you use. Now, when we talk about Sony cameras, so the Sony cameras provide different kind of metering options. But for wildlife photography, I'm going to talk about the two most important metering modes. One is the spot metering, the other is the multi-metering. Now, when we talk about spot metering, it is more of the camera capturing the light. So it's all about the reflective light metering what we talk about. So the camera calculates how much light is being reflected from the subject. It's all about tonality again. Just to give you a simple example, you have to think everything in terms of tonality when we talk about metering and not colors. Shades of gray. So for example, this is a black jacket, but then when we talk about tonality, it is dark. And then the Alpha logo over here, this is again white. So from a tonality point of view, we call it bright. So it is the shades of gray you have to think about. So this is something which you have to remember when we talk about metering. Now, the spot metering calculates the amount of light being reflected from that particular spot. So typically like it is going to be your center autofocusing point. Now, if your center autofocusing point is focusing on this dark tonality, then the camera gives you a particular exposure reading of ISO aperture shutter speed depending on what mode you're shooting in. The other combination which goes with spot metering, or rather metering in general, is the exposure compensation. So remember, one thing about exposure compensation is like depending on the tonality, you have to play around with exposure compensation, overexposure, underexposure. Let me share a quick tip regarding that. If you are shooting anything dark tonality, make sure your exposure compensation goes negative, minus. If you're shooting anything bright, that means you have to overexpose the subject. So this is the whole fundamental concepts of metering, the very famous Ansel Adams zonal system. Now this is about spot metering. Now the challenge what you face in spot metering is, if the subject starts to move, then you don't know where that spot is. So whether to overexpose, whether to underexpose is going to be confusing. Now that is where the multimetering comes into picture. Now in Sony, the way multimetering works, or rather in general in photography, the way multimetering works is it basically divides your entire frame into multiple segments. So the multimetering is also called as multi-segment metering. So what it does is it divides your entire frame into multiple segments, calculates the exposure, that is the amount of light reflecting from each of these segments, it averages it out. The reason being, the camera exposes everything as a medium tonality. So my recommendation is to go with the multimetering, and then based on the overall average tonality, overexpose or underexpose to get that perfect exposure. The next very important camera setting is obviously the autofocusing. In wildlife photography, in action photography, what kind of autofocusing points or the autofocusing cases or the autofocusing mode what you select determines whether you will be able to capture a crisp, sharp image or you're going to miss it. So in case of a Sony Alpha cameras, we have some of the very powerful autofocusing points, so which we call as the various focus area. Now quickly let me take you through the various options which are available and give a very brief description as to what it means. The very first one, focus area, is the wide. So as the name says, in the complete frame, whatever the subject the camera sees, where there is good amount of light and contrast, the camera is going to focus over there. The next one is the zone, which is again very similar to your wide, but in case of zone, it's just a smaller area, a smaller concentrated area, like it's a small composition framing within which the camera achieves autofocus, again based on the light and the contrast available in the frame. My personal favorite and the recommended one for wildlife photography is your last focusing area, which is the tracking. Now within the tracking, the best part about our Sony autofocusing system is within the tracking, all these various autofocusing points or the autofocusing focus area what I discussed is available in tracking. So in case of wildlife photography, you have to go with the focus area of tracking, and the default I keep is the spot S. Now the spot S, what happens is the center focusing point or just the single focusing point what you have, that is used to start the tracking on your subject. Now again here, let me give you an important tip as to which one to select when. Now majority of the cases the spot works, and an important tip again as to like how you need to use this for focusing is basically like the white square what you see. So do not press the autofocusing button immediately. So what you need to do is get that white square on the subject and then hit the autofocusing button, and then the automated tracking of the subject starts. Now the other important setting which you have to put in Sony is obviously the eye autofocusing option. So depending on the subject, whether it's a bird or an animal you're shooting, so go ahead and set that particular option. This is a killer combination for wildlife photography, especially with the tracking spot or the tracking wide and the eye autofocus enabled. Guaranteed you will not miss your shot. So remember, when it comes to extreme action photography for wildlife or even normal photography in wildlife, use this particular setting for autofocusing AF area mode of the tracking, spot or the wide with the animal eye focus on. So this is going to give you track sharp images every single time. In the next episode, we have a very interesting session on composition, lighting and creative images. Meanwhile, whatever you learned with us so far, please do share your work with us with the hashtag LearnWithSony, so that like we and I can take a look at your images and comment on that. All right then, I'll see you in the next Sony classroom.